The Mall Witch. Every year, in the last week of October, the Mall Witch arrived at the Carlisle Mall. Lots of towns had a mall Santa, but ours was the only one I knew that had a mall witch. Nobody ever seemed to recall hiring her, but she showed up every year, and folks seemed to go into a vague, forgetful trance while she was here. It was a rite of passage among us kids to go see the Mall Witch. She crouched in the center of the mall, under twinkling orange and purple lights. Her giant cauldron lurked next to her, sinister vapors wafting. In it lolled a child-sized mannequin, its face painted in a mask of terror. We kids would approach one at a time, trembling, to tell her what we wanted for Halloween. The October I was 7 was a rough one. My cousin Brett had come to visit for a few weeks while his parents were out of the country. 12 years old and a bully, he disdained trick-or-treating, let alone the Mall Witch. His favorite pastime during his visit was leaving skull-shaped prints on my arm and forehead from his real silver death's head ring. "That's baby stuff," he sneered, as I waited in line in the mall. "I bet you like to sit on Santa's lap, too, don't ya?" And, with a punch to my arm, he strode off, red and black lumberjack shirt flapping. I didn't care. It was nearly my turn for the witch. And then it was my turn, and I crept to her, ready to ask for candy, or some trifling thing. "So," she rasped, and her voice was dead leaves blowing across a mausoleum floor. "So, what would you like this year?" Her eyes followed my cousin away down the mall, and they gleamed greedily. "Anything special?" I gulped and whispered, "Just candy and peace and quiet." She nodded, and I scurried away in exhilarated terror. A month later, my cousin went missing. He had gone home by then, and my aunt called frantic to tell my mother. There was a huge search party, but Brett was never found. The year went by. Halloween crept up again, and I went, along with the other kids, to see the Mall Witch. I felt braver this year as I waited in line. After all, I was 8 now. Then I saw the mannequin and her cauldron. The mannequin dressed in a ragged red and black lumberjack shirt, with a silver death's head ring on its finger. The Mall Witch saw me and grinned nastily, her face splitting like a decaying toadstool. "Peaceful?" she rasped in her dead leaves voice, and then, "You can pay me later." I fled. That was all years ago. I'm an adult now, married. We had our first baby in June. I hadn't thought about the Mall Witch for years, not until now. My son's first Halloween. I forgot. The witch had said, "You can pay me later." I have a terrible feeling it's time to pay. The seasoning of the witch. I watched the oven as the skin crackled, the fragrant scent of meat and spices lingering in the kitchen. I stacked more wood into the stove. The heat must be even for the roast to be tender and delicate. A messenger knocked upon my door, calling me away from my duties. I implored my maid to watch over the roast while I went to the town square, but I tripped over the cobblestone path. The air clung with the stench of burning flesh. Shrieks of a burning woman cut through the massive crowd. The woman's name was Goody Porter. The town priest accused her of witchcraft after the children went missing. Her screams filled the air as the townspeople gathered, the priest glaring over them. They kneeled in abject silence, waiting for the screams to stop, for the priest to say it was safe to go home. Smiling as I watched her burn, her charred flesh peeling from her skin, and the stench of her torment rising to the heavens. I had always hated Goody and her simplistic ways. She was only a milkmaid. She had the intelligence of a child. There was no way she could be a threat to children. But she would stop by the path to collect flowers and pray to the old gods. So many villagers prayed to the old gods and would teach their children to do so. I would not have it. God would damn them from salvation. By accusing Goody, I was saving the town's future. The true God would consume everything, including the next generation. It would savor their souls in heaven. Goody's screams stopped, and the priest cried. He went on his usual sermon of "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." The same tiresome prattle he gave every Sunday, with a dose of fire and brimstone. I would suffer none of these witches, these pagans, to live. And the priest would give me all the children who misbehaved. With that said, I must return home. I have a roast to attend. The Curse of Witch's Wood. James Markham ran toward the village like a hare chased by wolves. Only when he was across the bridge in front of the church did he stumble to a stop. Almost 13 years old, he was swift and brave. His friend Philip's face was white. "You've been hunting in the witch's wood." "No," James said, trying to catch his breath, and noticed he was still clutching his bow. Yes, I was. Everyone knows not to go there. Old Man Harold was turned into a frog," James interrupted, 250 years ago. We've all been living in fear of a woman long since dead. You've had a pleasant stroll in the woods, then? Do a little bird watching, have you? James took a deep breath, his heart still racing. A beautiful little glen. I had the place to myself. Well, me and a nice plump pheasant. I drew my bow, and suddenly there she was, the witch. I didn't wait for introductions. Her eyes were like boiled eggs. She started to raise her hand, and before I could even think, my feet were moving. God knows what she was planning to do. Well, you don't look like a frog. No? James looked down at himself, patting his thighs. I feel fine. Lucky you. The next morning, James was not a frog, nor did he feel fine. His eyes ached and seemed swollen, bulging. His skin had taken on a yellow tint. His fingers were shorter. His parents summoned the village barber, who carried a leather bag of clinking metal tools. He peered at the boy for a while and then left. Please keep him in his room until I return, and remain outside, he said. In the afternoon he returned with a village alchemist, astrologist, and blacksmith in tow, all 4 branches of contemporary science. The mother and father were distraught. I can't bear to look. He's turning into a frog, she cried. It's better to remain outside, the barber said. The parents waited as the 4 men went inside and discussed the situation, low voices punctured by muttered oaths. At long last, the barber finally came out. He's a frog, isn't he? The mother cried. A frog, the barber said, is just a symbol of whatever thing, neither man nor beast, he is becoming. probably the same fate as Old Man Harold, and a frog was the only idea that made sense to our ancestors. However, frogs have only 4 limbs. Frogs have bones. His body is still changing. The mother burst into the room, and her husband could hear her scream and wail. The barber shook his head. "I have to go in," said the father. Moments later, the father returned. His voice was thick. "That is no longer our son. Do what you must." As the unfortunate result of the witch's curse, the Markham house burned down. Mother, father, and daughter survived, but James, unfortunately, was lost. No one hunts in Witch's Wood. If a witch bleeds, she dies. The most powerful weapon an assassin can have is, of course, the elf bolt. These flint arrowheads, tinted yellow at the very edge, are alleged to have once been forged by vengeful elves and used to kill man's cattle. Their use is difficult to detect, as by some weird magic they kill without breaking the skin. Each elf bolt can only be used once. None are immune to their effects, it is said. How many murders by elf bolt have occurred over the years, leaving coroners scratching their heads? They are extremely difficult to make or obtain, for better or worse. Once, there lived an undistinguished hitman who wished to differentiate himself from his rivals and amass fabulous wealth. But alas, he was too impetuous to hone his art through discipline and dedication. The hitman didn't dismiss elf bolts as myth, for he'd seen his own father felled by one, whilst they were hunting in the woods. The hitman didn't hate the archer who'd taken his father's life, as the hitman knew that his father had many enemies, and that the archer was simply a means to an end. After years of searching, the hitman captured, chained, and tortured the archer, until the archer finally garbled the information which the hitman wished to hear. Where the elf bolt came from. "A witch made it," the archer sobbed, begging with his eyes for death. After several more days of pain, the hitman accepted that the archer did not know where the witch could be found. So after allowing the archer to swallow a razor blade, the hitman set off to find the witch for himself. He ventured deeper into the woods than any man had ever set before, and many, many miles from where our civilization ends. He found a woman by a brook, conversing with mushrooms in a frequency ears cannot hear. The hitman bound the woman in rope and took her to his subterranean hideout, finding the archer somehow still alive. The hitman produced a flint and demanded that the woman produce elf bolts. But the woman couldn't understand his language, even when he broke off a sharp arrowhead and mimed an agonizing death by clutching at his throat and clawing at his chest. The archer, with swollen tongue, garbled for him not to give the arrowhead to the woman, for if a witch bleeds, she dies. Angered, the hitman demanded that the woman conjure him an elf bolt from thin air by dawn, or he'd burn her alive, and with that he went to bed. Sometime that night, the razor blade completed its internal journey, and the archer finally died. The woman used the blade to free herself, and for the longest time she stood over the hitman, pondering what to do, whilst he slept uneasily. The gentle creature just couldn't comprehend these savages and their strange ways. She decided to give the hitman what she thought he wanted, by slipping the razor blade into his mouth and massaging his Adam's apple until he swallowed. A rolling witch tells the truth. "All right, you effing hag. You gonna cooperate now?" The witch shook her head in frustration, silky black hair clinging to her face. Jay had even taken her hat as a precaution. Try as she might, she couldn't bust loose from the excessively thick duct tape, fetters keeping her restrained to the office chair. Jay noticed her hands trying to wiggle around inside the softball-sized wads of duct tape covering them. "Oh," he said with smugness, "you can't move your little skeleton fingers either. No little hexes on me." She cackled in a way a cat hisses, defensively. Jay spun her around again. Witches hate getting spun. One of the old proverbs or tricks Jay had read in preparation for this day. Nothing pisses off a witch more than spinning them. So far, that was holding true, but getting Jay nowhere. He let the witch stop on her own accord. Her haggard, homely face was now beautiful and pouty. She was batting her large eyelashes, lecherously biting her own lip, and doing an unnatural little tongue trick just on the other side of her now perfect teeth. "Fucker," Jay thought. She must have a charm or something. Then he noticed it right there, a ruby-red nose piercing. Jay plunged his forefinger into the witch's cute little button nose and yanked the piercing out. Her sexy facade melted away, and she was once again the ugly hag he had tracked down and bagged the night before. He tossed the piercing over his shoulder and yelled at her again. "Tell me where the children are." She rolled her eyes. "I know you've nabbed dozens of kids in the last month alone. Tell me where they are." She scoffed, as if annoyed that that was the reason she was bound to an office chair. Jay spit. "Well, as they say, a rolling witch tells the truth. Isn't that right?" The witch's eyes bulged, and she glanced down at the chair for the first time, realizing it could roll. Jay kicked the chair between her knees, and she flew across the garage. Out of breath and in extreme discomfort, she screamed, "Okay! They're disguised as pumpkins in the southern patch. Just stop rolling me!" 20 minutes later, Jay was dragging the hag by a rope to the patch. "The kids are pumpkins?" She cackled in a deep, throaty way. "What?" Jay's heart sank before he could finish that question. The pumpkins opened up, jagged mouths, and hopped towards Jay with frightening gracefulness. "But I rolled you!" Jay shouted, arms and legs being devoured. "The wheels were locked, you moron. I was sliding and lying the whole time." Jay growled in equal parts pain and anger. The pumpkins chewed and slurped on his muscles and gristle. The witch became beautiful again and squirmed free from her binding. She produced a large broom from under her skirt and took to the skies with another malevolent crackle. The children were never found. The Witch in the Woods. My grandfather always sat us around the fireplace and told us about his childhood and the small New England village he grew up in. He would always regale us of his adventures with he and his friends throughout the village and the surrounding woods. But there was one story that we haven't forgotten to this day, and never will. Now, this particular tale, my grandfather and his friends were playing in the deep woods surrounding their village. My grandfather said he began to notice that they were getting to a part of the woods they've never been before. but didn't get too concerned because him and his friends were having such a good time. And the woods were just so beautiful. It was fall, you see, and he said that the colors of the leaves were simply mesmerizing. The bright reds, yellows, and oranges popped from every tree branch. The deeper he and his friends got, it seemed that they were more and more entranced by the beautiful colors. The air was cool and crisp. There was a sweet aroma wafting from the distance, almost encircling them. Faster and faster they went, jumping and laughing. Around and around they played, moving and shouting, spinning and spinning. Just then they stopped, and when they did, they just stood there in awe. In the distance, there stood a cabin, long and dark, with a big black tree that stood over the cabin next to the far window of the dilapidated cottage. It looked eerie, especially surrounded by other trees in the forest. It had no leaves, and it was dark as a cold winter's night. The children stood there looking at the cabin with their jaws dropped. They didn't even know anyone lived out this far into the woods. Their parents never mentioned it, and no one in town ever talked about a person living in the woods. As my grandfather and his friends began to discuss what they were looking at, the front door of the cabin swung open. Out walked a slender old woman with long black hair, with silver streaks throughout, holding a basket of breads and pastries. That was the sweet smell the boys had smelled earlier. My grandfather said she looked eerie. Something about her seemed off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something spooky about the old woman. As he stared at her, she looked up and noticed the boys looking at her. She smiled an evil smile, he said. Then she spoke to them. "Hello, boys. What are you doing over there? Why don't you come in? I have many tasty goodies inside. Cupcakes, pastries, candies, even ice cream." My grandfather and his friends looked at each other in amazement. They've never seen so many foods all at once. They walked toward the front of the cabin as she smiled at each one as they entered. My grandfather stopped in his tracks. It felt like he was being dragged into that cabin by the smells of the food, and every time she opened her mouth, it felt like he was being dragged closer and closer to the front door. Just then he saw a rock, picked it up, and hurled it towards her head, hitting her right between her eyes. Her concentration was interrupted, and he turned and ran away, running non-stop all the way into town, telling anyone who would listen what had happened. Most of the men in the village and the families of his friends followed him back to the dark old cabin in the woods. But to my grandfather's dismay, the old cabin wasn't there. Just the old black oak tree that stood over it, and next to it, on the ground, sat a basket of delicious treats. Needless to say, my grandfather's friends were never heard from again, and my grandfather and his family were forced to leave the village. So if you ever come across a dark cabin in the woods, under a black oak tree, and you start smelling delicious treats in the air, stop, turn around, and if anyone is with you, make sure they stay right by your side, because you've just encountered a witch, and she's hungry for you. What started out as my funniest Halloween turned out to be the scariest. Just took me 30 years to realize it. Growing up, my best friend was Robert Moretti, a fast-talking Italian boy who was bigger and tougher than most kids our age. I'd known him since we were preschoolers, just beyond Robert's house, was a dead-end street. One of the houses on it was the Hanson house, a supposed haunted house, which inspired countless urban legends and ghoulish tales. The only person reportedly living there, back then, was the mother and son. The mother, they said, was a witch. The boy, Tommy Hanson, was close to our age, but nobody I knew played with him or anything. In fact, he was rarely seen leaving his house. He must have been homeschooled or something. One particular Halloween, Robert devised a brilliant plan of trick-or-treating at the haunted house. So we did, and I damn near got scared to death. This was 1990. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was the thing. So Robert and I dressed up as Michelangelo and Leonardo, respectively. Oh, to be 12 again. With our bags stuffed with candy, we slowly walked our way up towards the old Hanson house. When we came to the place, we stopped in front of it and regarded it for a moment. The house was big and ugly and made of stone. Plus, it smelled of worms. The moon was full. The air was cool and crisp. A smattering of trick-or-treaters were huddled outside the Hansons' front door, but not many, and they didn't stay long. "Hurry up, Paul," Robert said nervously. He nudged me forward. I went. I walked tepidly along the pathway, running beside the driveway, which led to the front door. A scarecrow was sitting lifelessly on a wooded bench next to the door, looking solemnly toward the street. It looked kind of scary. It wore overalls stuffed with hay, and a scarf as old as dirt. On its head was a spine-chilling jack-o'-lantern with sharp, slanted eyes and a toothy grin that made me cringe. It looked like it wanted to bite me. Something about it didn't seem right. I could feel its empty eyes penetrating me as I got nearer. By this time, it was just me and Robert. All the other trick-or-treaters had disappeared. Robert nudged me forward. Grudgingly, I lumbered on, ignoring the hideous Halloween prop sitting on the bench, until I reached the front door to the Hanson house. I was nervous, but I didn't let it show. With Robert by my side, egging me on, I pushed the glowing red doorbell. Suddenly, as I was preparing to come face to face with the Hanson witch, as she was often referred to, the scarecrow lunged at me, arms extended, and grabbed my neck. I screamed, dropped my bag of candy, and split. Robert followed. The two of us didn't hesitate. We booked it down the walkway away from that Hanson house and never looked back. Robert teased me for a month about how scared I was. He later told me that the Scarecrow Man was an annual prank the Hansons liked to play on the public. The Scarecrow was actually the boy Tommy. What a great costume, he said. I agreed, but I wanted revenge. That's why the following year, when Robert suggested we find a video camera, record some other kids getting scared to death, then send the tape to America's Funniest Home Videos with Bob Saget, I agreed. I borrowed my father's camera. Back then, those cameras were highly regarded and quite expensive. So, when I say borrowed, I use that term loosely. The sky was ominous and dull. The streetlights mingled with the pale moonlight, creating the perfect backdrop for our childish prank. Robert was dressed up as the Terminator. I was Axl Rose, I remember. We crept even closer to the Hanson house. A handful of parents could be seen loitering on the sidewalk, but not many. When we arrived at the Hanson house, we watched as a group of kids in silly costumes approached the front door. A girl dressed up as Catwoman pressed the doorbell. When the door opened, she shouted, "Trick or treat!" I could see the sneer in Mrs. Hanson's face as she gave away her toothsome treats. It gave me chills. She really was a witch. Her costume was elaborate, flawless. Her skin was sickly green and covered in warts. Her long, pointed nose was as sharp as a blade. Her teetering black hat sparkled under the glow of the waning porch light. I didn't want to get any closer to her. Nope, not one bit. Robert pulled me aside. "Give me your camera," he demanded. I obliged. He powered it up. "There he is." He pointed to the scarecrow on the bench. "That must be Tommy. Look at him in that ridiculous costume." Robert was doing his best to sound brave, but I knew better. Sitting limply on the brown bench next to the front door was the scarecrow, with its carved pumpkin head, just like the previous year. Only this year it seemed uglier. Its crudely carved eyes seemed to regard me with mild amusement, his dagger-like teeth daring me to come closer. I knew Tommy must be inside the costume, but you wouldn't know it from looking at the thing. Robert pointed the camera and told me to get going. Slowly, as if inspecting every maple leaf that was crackling at my feet, I left the safety of the sidewalk and edged toward the Hanson house. "Hurry up, fool," Robert insisted. He shoved me again, harder this time. I tried to move, but my feet were not cooperating. In truth, I was spooked, both of the scarecrow and of the witch waiting at the front door. Finally, I took a deep breath, held it, then found my courage. What was I afraid of? I remember thinking, I'm 13 years old. I'm too old to be spooked. As I got going, my eyes never left the scarecrow, sitting inertly on the bench. Any minute now, Tommy will leap out from the bench and terrify that unsuspecting little girl. Instead, after Catwoman and her friends collected their candy, they said thank you, then scurried off. The scarecrow did not budge. Another group of trick-or-treaters appeared. We let them go ahead of us. This was our chance. Robert, who was close behind me, said, "Act natural." I was shaking. Again, the scarecrow was unresponsive to the fresh batch of trick-or-treaters. They simply came and went. Something inside me was stirring. Anger. 364 days of pent-up teenage angst was about to burst. I became unhinged. With unwarranted bravery, I charged at the scarecrow on the bench. Robert shouted, "Wait!" But it was too late. Unfortunately, I tripped on my shoelaces, a lifelong habit, and fell flat on my face, directly in front of the scarecrow. Its soiled black boots were too big for any boy my age, I realized, unhappily. Still, on my knees, I looked up, directly into the scarecrow's pumpkin-carved eyes. A candle flame flickered from inside the jack-o'-lantern. Robert, who was still holding the camera, shouted, "Trick or treat, you stupid pumpkin brain!" and started laughing and jumping up and down. Mrs. Hanson, the witch, came out from the front door and spat at him. The cackling of her voice sent chills down my spine. I turned my attention to her for a moment. When I looked back at the scarecrow, I could see Tommy's gray eyes lurking inside the jack-o'-lantern, although he wasn't there a moment ago. It winked. Then it lumbered towards me. "Ah!" I screamed. By then, the other trick-or-treaters were laughing and pointing and joking, asking Tommy Hanson to show them the inside of his jack-o'-lantern. Tommy refused. Instead, he simply sat back down on the bench and went still, waiting for his next unsuspecting victim. I was furious. Robert dragged me away from the front door. We didn't bother asking for candy. I think he was spooked by Tommy's mother, the witch, although he'd never admit to this. We teased each other for the next half hour. Then I went home and cleaned up my poop-stained underpants for the second year in a row. The next day at school, We shared a heartfelt laugh. Robert, who initially refused to return my father's camera, eventually gave it back, after we'd watched the footage over and over again at his place. The funniest part, of course, was my reaction. One moment the scarecrow was sitting languidly on the bench. The next moment it was attacking me. We soon forgot about this incident, seeing how there was other cool stuff happening at school that stole our interest, and needless to say, I never bothered sending the tape to America's Funniest Home Videos. Eventually, the video camera, along with the tape, ended up in a taped-up cardboard box, waiting in my father's garage for 30 years. When he passed away this summer, my son Brandon discovered it. Brandon, who is now the same age as I was on the tape, was intrigued by this relic from the past. He's an audio geek and currently going through his analog infatuation stage. Brandon took the tape, digitized it, then played it for me recently. It was a blast from the past, I tell you. I thought it was hysterical. Brandon, on the other hand, was alarmed. "Watch what happens when we zoom in," he said, in a shaky voice. When he zoomed in, I shuddered. "This must be a mistake," I told him. He assured me it was not. He backtracked, and I watched the scene again, this time with a careful eye. There I was at 13, dressed as my favorite rock star, standing 6 feet in front of the scarecrow on the bench. "Now watch this," Brandon said. I watched. My stomach was in knots. I watched as that young boy on the screen, who looks eerily like Brandon, only smaller, came alive. The camera is pointed at my back. I make a beeline for the bench, falling flat on my face. The camera shakes as Robert is shouting something, but only for a moment. Then he zooms in on the scarecrow. Without warning, the scarecrow springs out of his sitting position with his arms stretched out, just as I'm returning to my feet, and attacks me. I scream and trip and fall down again. I'd forgotten that part. That must have been when I crapped my pants. Soon, we are ambushed by a bunch of bratty boys who swarm the scarecrow, and then the video cuts off. Brandon tweaked the settings on the screen and rewound the video. "Now check this out." He pressed play. Only now it played in slow motion, zoomed in entirely on the scarecrow. "Just as I suspected," I said under my breath. "Well, I'll be." "Dad," Brandon said, "what the hell is that thing?" I could see now, inside the jack-o'-lantern, and yes, there was a small flame flickering inside it, except it wasn't an actual flame, probably a cheap dollar store replica, but still. "Now here's where it gets extra creepy," he said. "Watch carefully." He pointed to the screen. I watched. For a moment, the scarecrow seemed unaffected, lifeless. Then suddenly a face appears inside the pumpkin head. "What the—" I muttered. "Right? Play it again." He did. I gasped. "This is impossible," Brandon said. He was intrigued, although the fear in his eyes was beyond doubt. But there was something else in his eyes, the inevitable curiosity of a 13-year-old boy. It wasn't long before he'd convinced me to bring him and his best friend Bruno Moretti to that spooky old house for Halloween. Apparently, Bruno knew all about the Hansen house. I drove by the Hansen house this morning to scope it out. I hadn't been to that part of town in many years. What amazed me as I drove past the place was how unaffected by time the house seemed. To be fair, the place is over 150 years old, so what's another 30 years, right? Still, I didn't like it. Nor did I like the scarecrow, sitting corpse-like on the bench, out on the veranda. I pulled the car over and got out. "I'm not crazy," I told myself, as I trotted toward the scarecrow, smartphone in hand. I pointed my phone at the scarecrow and pressed record, just in case. I stood for a moment, 6 feet in front of it, unsure of what to do next. I waved goodbye jokingly, then I got back inside my car and tore out of there. My heart was beating faster than I cared to admit. I didn't tell Brandon about my venture, but I wish I had, because there's no way in hell that I'm taking him to that Hansen house tonight. I won't do it, no matter how much of a fuss he makes. I just watched the video and saw something disturbing, something I didn't notice at the time. When I zoomed in, even an old fart like me can do that on my Android. I saw the witch standing outside the front door, leering at me, although I swear she wasn't there at the time. That's not all. The scarecrow, who was sitting listlessly on the brown bench by the front door, suddenly sat upright. I saw the flickering light of a candle flame from deep inside the jack-o'-lantern switch to a boy's eye. It winked at me. Then it lunged at me. I'd forgotten that part. Thank you so much for joining me. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess_of.darkness or Twitter at duchessofdarkn2. Also, please send me your stories or poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. Until next time.